started with death information, finding the certificates and the records, and finding substitutes or thinking about what a substitute can be, or an indirect means of getting a death record fast. Because what I want to talk to you about today are your expectations that you have based on the real documents for a particular time period. So first of all, one of the things I want you to consider in the first place is, what do you expect to find? If you're looking back before the mid 1750s, you're going to have a hard time finding an actual death document. In England, if you happen to be inside a barony or one of the hundreds or something like that, you might find a reference to a death in the actual court minutes within just that particular area. But you have to think smart about when rules came into effect and what kind of rules there were. When you think about countries that had state religions, like England, like France, other places, you can begin to think that there might have been some standardized procedure because of the particular religion. And we covered that kind of last spring when I talked to you in May about baptism and birth records and what a real expectation is. So think about the information you want. Do you just want to know the date of the death? Do you want to know more with the context? I know I sure always want to know more with context, because that's a very, very important thing to me. And so you should examine the vital records laws for the particular state or country for the time period. And luckily, I'm just going to tell you again, one of the best places that you're going to find that is out at familysearch.org for background on every country, just because they keep checking back. I mean, it's amazing even to see in any of the Western states in the United States that you see how death laws and other vital records are constantly being tweaked, or preparation for a tweak by a legislature or whatever. So knowing the background and the history behind this is essential if you're going to have some realistic expectations. So you need to know when official record keeping began in a colony or a state. And so we can see that early on, as soon as people got to Massachusetts, yes, by 1632, which was 12 years later, they had a system in place for collecting vital records. And it came, of course, from the first 2 years when they were in the area, and they lost so many people during the first winter. It was not a good beginning for them. So you can look, and luckily we have so many online places today where we can find that information. But you need to know what records are available in that time period. The laws, maybe they were just a law governing only that colony. You know, Massachusetts colony was very different again from the Virginia colony. As Connecticut came online as a colony, it was different again. So you have to look. You cannot, in those early colonial days in America, assume that they will be the same. In the period before 1776, and that's a century and a half in the United States, from 1620 forward, you need to have an idea of what records were kept, where you can find them in the minutes for each little town in Massachusetts, for example, and who kept them. Were they both civil record and religious record at the same time? Were they kept separate? Make sure you know. And of course, the denomination for a particular church is going to keep its records differently, as we covered in the birth records last spring. And those are the most intricate of those church records, I believe. You'll find that many denominations kept very, very different things based on it. They might not keep a baptism record, but they keep a record of when people come into their denomination, and they will have probably at least birth records or something close. And you need to watch what laws are governing death records today, because they are very different. They can be very different across the United States. And again, the reason that we talk about this is the more you know, the easier it's going to be to acquire that record. What is reasonable? Are they going to make you pay up front to get a record? Are they going to allow you to have a record and pay afterwards? Which of their records are free out online, or where are they at these big vital record databases or these big, and we love them, things like Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. So, of course, you already know. I'm just going to remind you here quickly where you can find those: the church records of deaths and burials, city and county civil registrations, family Bibles, personal histories, newspapers. I'll show you one today that I found interesting. Obituaries, but again, we all have to be careful of obituaries, and we have to be mindful of the person or the entity that produced that obituary. What was left in, what was taken out, was it from a different person's viewpoint? If you find competing obituaries in a newspaper, please let me know. There's always interesting stories about that. Probate records, tombstones out at a free place like Find a Grave, for example. But you're always going to want to confirm that it is an official record. You will always want to source that document and explain carefully where you got that. So you might find a list in a local newspaper in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and into the early 1940s, in fact, in Montana and other rural places. In the weekly newspaper, you can find something like what I found here in the Harlowton, Montana newspaper, a complete resume of news events in Wheatland County during 1938, published the first week in 1939, covering several pages. And so it has every death in there. And I call to your attention, number 10, no, it wasn't his death date. It was just number 10 in January. Hans Eriksson, age 60, was found dead on his farm 10 miles south of Barber. So you've got that particular piece of information. Today, we can go look at something like this and see his medical certificate of death and see a little tiny more. In 1938, we were already in Montana and in other states. It's interesting to see that we were talking about the principal causes of death, whether or not a doctor or the attendant for that particular death certificate actually saw that person alive. No, this one didn't. He was the coroner at Rygate, Montana, for Golden Valley County. And notice that death was reported over in Wheatland County in its newspaper. Contributory causes were there, tests confirming the diagnosis, whether there was an autopsy. Well, take a look at this, because you can look at all of the lines, and all we get in comparison to what we saw in the Harlowton newspaper, that it appeared to be, or it was judged to be, natural causes, probably 2 days before he was found, because he was found on the 17th in a field at his place. And they said he probably died 2 days before, and no other information there, even though other tests or other things could have been done. So I call this to your attention, because even though you can say that the law was there asking for that information, it doesn't mean that it was necessarily filled in, or that there was a person in that county who made the final check and said, sorry, coroner, you didn't fill in the entire record. Now today, there is a person who does check on that to the best of their ability. So we get one that's a little better filled in. So by 1907 in Montana, along with other states in the United States and the territories, because that would include a couple of states that we have today that were not states then, you had to, theoretically anyway, fill this medical certificate of death in, but it didn't mean that there was always someone there to make that check. Those things generally come later. This is 31 years after we were compelled to begin reporting deaths, and we had some death record. And I can tell you that Montana's death record changed at least 3 times in between 1907 and this one for 1938. So today's certificate is going to give you the name of the person who died. Hopefully the AKAs, especially in the case of people who were incarcerated or who were better known by a nickname. Nicknames can be in those also known as names. It'll give the age, the birth date and place, the death date and place. And one of the things you want to pay attention to in Montana and most every other place, but Montana and the western states for sure, is it will be checked by a coroner, at least briefly, or a coroner's examiner if it occurred at home. So if you find out on a death certificate that someone in our state, that the death certificate was at least referred to the coroner, there may be another record. You might have a brief coroner report of another type, and you should check that out. I have not found that I got much more than this if it happened to be at a residence and they found the body within that day. You'll find the occupation, whether or not the person was in the military, their education in great detail today, we'll see that, their ethnicity. But sometimes the ethnicity is kind of funny because if you're looking at some things recently, sometimes people want to find out, they wanted to find out for a long time whether or not people were of Hispanic origin, so they knew how many people we had within the state, and other states did too. The parents, mom's maiden name, if it's known, and the informant, the address of that informant, the funeral home, so you can find records, because maybe you're not having the good fortune that we have here with our funeral home records being digitized so that they are available, and the cemetery or the disposition of the body. What you will find with regard to the disposition of the body is if the body has been cremated, there may be quite a bit of information available to you because more than one person needs to sign off on that cremation today as a result of our laws. So this is one, and I just showed the nurse practitioner here who confirmed this one. I'm not showing you the name of the person, but here's the date when that person was pronounced dead, that actual time in military time, the license number of the particular nurse practitioner, the date she signed it, and it shows the cause of death with approximate time that that person suffered, or they knew that that person suffered that. It tells you whether or not an autopsy is performed, were autopsy findings available if an autopsy was performed. It tells you that the manner of death for this was natural versus accident, suicide, homicide, pending an investigation, or could not be determined. And honest, we're still finding could not be determined today. Found 2 of them in the 2004 death records that we are busy digitizing right now. Tobacco use is still important in terms of contributing to that death. And this one says no. For a female, certain questions about pregnancies that may or may not have effect, and this particular person was a male. No injuries, and so that does not to be filled out. No traffic accident, describe how the injury occurred, and so on. So it's pretty thorough. Now, this is just 1/4 of today's death certificate. I'm just showing you this part to see how intricate this has gotten across states as we know more. If you've ever wondered how we get those death certificates each year out of the National Institutes of Health or other places, or we get something that you see out at USA Today Facts, these are where these things come from, because these things, of course, are put together. We can surely put them together more, a little better than we could in 1914 when they were still looking at data that was from the US Census of 1910. So I'm just going to tell you again here that you need to get the best info because otherwise you're going to have questions. My brother and his kids had questions, and getting a death certificate for them, it was, I'm flattered that they wanted to come to Aunt Jan, but I want them to learn where to go on their own also, so that they know what's available at the time of their death. So in a church notice of a death from 2 centuries ago, there might be the name, there might be the age, and there sometimes might be a cause. I'm very familiar with deaths in Norway from 2 centuries ago, actually from 1798 forward, and you will see some pretty good record keeping because the state church also kept the record for the state. And so it's pretty thorough. Maybe you'll find just a simple statement like we saw in that Harleton newspaper, one county over from where the guy died. Here's a thing that says Jethro Jones died last Monday. Maybe that's all you're ever going to find. And sometimes you have to be happy with that indirect evidence. Maybe that's when you begin to look to see whether or not Jethro Jones had a will, or if he died intestate, that means without a will, did he at least have enough property that there had to be an inventory made of that property, and the inventory will refer to the death date. Just another place to get the best information. What would I do? I would collect all of that information and use it to buttress all of the other things that I had obtained, not just one document. There might be a formal brief certificate like what you would see in 1907 in many states that were not from the East Coast, just the name, the age, sometimes the birth date if they could find it, the death date, sometimes a place, but not an address, sometimes the parents, but not. And even though you know that the certificate demands were there from a law in a state, don't assume that all of those things would be filled in or that they are available to you later on. You're going to have to look at what the practice was. Candidly, here in Cascade County, it was 1916 through 1919. I was still seeing that in the newspaper, there would occasionally be a rather large ad from the keeper of data in this county saying, parents, you are responsible to get that birth record in. Maybe the doctor might have done it, but parents needed to get it in too. And we saw that it became even more important by 1936 when you had to have a record of your birth in order to join Social Security. So sometimes there's a place, sometimes there's an address. A lot of things don't get filled in. And sometimes there's that list in the local newspaper at the end of the year, which will at least will aim you towards information you might find. So I'm going to refer you right back to the United States death records using Family Search's guided search. You know how to go there. Go to familysearch.org. Under search, go down nearly to the bottom and select Research Wiki. We've done this before in some other of my talks. And then select the death records or the death records for any other country. You're going to be able to find them there. And it's going to tell you the contents. Commonly with this, you're going to find how to find a death record using their guided research for each state. It's pretty pro forma, I'll tell you that. Where to find the Social Security death index. Be careful of that one because sometimes the death date might be off by 1 or 2 days. I'm just saying you want to look for the death certificate if you can find it. Where are the death certificates and how regularly are they available to the public? They are different from birth records. Birth records generally are not available for a long period of time. Death certificates, depending on the state, may be available to you immediately, or especially for family, or they may be available depending on the particular law for the state. This place is also going to tell you how to interpret the cause of death when you're not certain. It's going to give you links, for example, to language that we don't use today, but it was used 2 centuries ago in terms of describing what caused the deaths, places to look, and of course, a real thorough review for you of the sources and how you can best use them. And of course, they have the map. And if you're into the map, instead of looking at the state in a list, then you can just go right to that map and it'll give you information. We've done this before a couple of times. There's going to be wiki articles for the church records for each U.S. state or each U.S. place. For Massachusetts, for example, or for Pennsylvania, which was very different as a colony in terms of allowing churches to keep their own records and having many churches in there. So remember, Pennsylvania did not have a state church. In fact, it was freedom of religion there. And so you have to look to the information within church records. So you can do that here, and you can find the church records in terms of looking at those things. The hardest records that I've seen to find right now are the records for the Eastern Catholic Orthodox records, at least in the Northwest. Some of the easiest records to find today out online are the records for the Lutheran churches, because they have been put out online. They are in many places and they are free to you. Sometimes, again, remember, if people could not get a child baptized or did not have a place to record the death, they may be looking at those churches that are in the area. So it's always worth looking there also. If you find that you're with a family that did not really have a connection with a religion, you're going to have to look at community notes in newspapers, etc., to see what you might find. And I really hope that you don't find that the courthouse burned at some point and burned your records. Here's a new book for you. Came out just recently, A Genealogist's Guide to the American Colonies, Part 1, The New England Colonies. All of these different things from 1607 through 1775, meaning that the 1607 stuff actually took some of those things from the old country, the records they brought from the old country with them. So it's a real boon. This again is our friend William Dollarhide. He's done so much for us, but he's also looking at what's available out online. He has over 900 links out there that you can look at. Yes, we'll have one in the library here in Great Falls this week, and you're certainly welcome to come in and look. He says he's got 2 other books coming that will work with the southern colonies, and I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming the middle colonies, and I'm hoping that he does the Spanish and the French colonies along our other borders in the United States, because that would be a big help. We have this book here. I highly recommend it as a Christmas present to yourself. You know, we all have to get a Christmas present for ourselves. It's a 2019 copyright. We have one in the library here, the census book. You're just going to use this thing all the time. It was written for us, for genealogists, for family historians. And guess what? Colleges use this when they are teaching about the various U.S. censuses. It's simply one of the best things available to you. He cuts right through it, makes things short, shows you what's really available and what you should expect to see in each state. And the reason I'm doing this is one of the first things they hit on getting is mortality records. He also has another one called Substitutes for the Lost 1890 U.S. Federal Census, where none of us got very much information unless we were from one tiny place in Alaska and one tiny place in Michigan, where they managed to save the records. We have that also in our library here. And I'm just saying, sometimes he can recommend to you things that you won't find. People have asked me, they said, oh boy, we have mortality records. I need to get the mortality records for 1810. Well, they won't be there because the mortality records didn't start until 1850. So you're going to have to know some of these substitutes. Your historical background is really going to influence your search and save you time. I have people say, when I'm looking and I'm helping them with stuff, how I know this information. Well, I've gathered it over a lot of years. I do know which countries began collecting consistent death records, whether they were a state church or they were civil registration, or when someone took over civil registration, as what happened in Norway about 5 or 6 years ago. Norway went from a record in which the church, the official state church, was still collecting the records for the country, and they went to civil registration 6 years ago. So there are changes there. How have they used it? That's primary. And how did they collect information from it to summarize the things that they need across the country? So we have Napoleon Bonaparte, whose rules became a turning point because they replaced feudal laws in European countries. He did that in France in 1806. And as he conquered countries later on, he insisted that his Napoleonic civil code be used with reference to various kinds of civil registrations. Now, again, it doesn't mean that countries all over adopted those things, because I can tell you German civil registration did not begin until between 1876 and 1879, but you will find some civil registrations in the smaller Germanic duchies, etc., before that, as per Napoleonic law. So it just gives you more places to look. In the United States, we required national level death information because we said, what are we going to do? We have yellow fever raging up and down the Mississippi River. We have various kinds of diseases. And of course, we had the flu epidemic later on, but people were eager to know, and doctors were eager to know what was the cause, and could they settle on one or two definitions that described a particular type of death. So we had to do all of those things. And the national censuses in the United States, which began in 1790, were a big influence. But the national censuses also used information from other countries as to what they were collecting, plus the colonial censuses, the few of them that had been done, in order to get into information collecting that would make things good for us today. So we finally began, we did some informal looking in a few states before 1850, but Congress was the primary mover finally, with physicians demanding it, asking for a US mortality schedule in 1850. And again, they had some pretty good things. They had the Napoleonic Code from March 21, 1804, still being used, still extant. You can find it out there with revisions. It played a big part in beginning various kinds of data for continental Europe and for Latin America. So we not only had that, and by the way, I'm going to push another book here. Here's the latest one that I found. Louis Sarkozy was on booktv.com 2 weekends ago. You can find it just by looking at booktv.com and get an overview of this really pretty neat look at Napoleon. He wasn't just consistent about official information across all types of vital records. Napoleon was a reader. He had a personal library of over 70,000 volumes. You're going to be able to read about his books and their influence on him as he went from place to place. He had a smaller library that he carried with him. I would not have liked to have been his librarian, but he was such a big influence on officially kept information across countries. Within the military, what kind of records did they begin to keep as a result of his influence? So there's more than just his influence on vital records. Early US stats collection, we had 1632, Virginia colony had a registration law for births, deaths, and marriages. And Massachusetts had a similar one at that point, but they were not the same, and they were collected very, very differently because, again, those were colonies all on their own. By 1840, in the 1840s, we had this thing called the American Medical Association, and they were the ones who really hammered on the fact that in order to give reliable information and in order to standardize the things that they were calling various kinds of death, they needed to begin collecting mortality statistics. So in 1850, they asked that that data be collected, and it's for the 1850 through 1885 mortality censuses. I believe they were all collected on a similar platform in order to develop support for sanitary reform and public health. So they actually collected it beginning in 1849, June 1 of 1849, going through May 31 of 1850. And every state that was there at that point collected its data. They were compelled to by law, and they sent that data in. And it would take 3, 4, 5 years for the US Congress and its people who did the report to actually produce that report. But we began to get more information. And as we got more information, some questions did change. Now, that book by Dollarhide that I told you about, the yellow one that I said would be a great Christmas present for you, he tells you all about those, and he gives you the forms and shows you what it really looks like. And it was pretty thorough. What we discovered as a result of that process over that 35 years was that we needed to be collecting a whole bunch more. We needed to be collecting it every year. In fact, we needed to be collecting it every month. And so our collection process began and was formalized by states in consistent laws. And so you'll find them a little better. In 1885, Colorado and Dakota Territory, including both South and North Dakota, and Florida and Nebraska and New Mexico, collected one last time because they wanted some more information. As you can see, Dakota was in the process of becoming a state, and those two states, South and North, became states at the same time Montana did in 1889. But it provided a powerful lot of information to local health units in the United States. It gave the AMA and medical schools a great deal of information so they could begin to standardize processes. And most important, it helped us to work on some uniform laws that could help us with sanitary reform, public health in general, and so on. Because I can tell you in 1902, in Cascade County alone, when I see the number of kids, little kiddos, who die from this thing on a death record called summer complaint, because that's what they called it then. Who knows what it really was? They didn't have to standardize that language in Montana, you see, until 1907. So think about what you're looking for. I tell you this because I don't just want death dates for my people. I want to know the context. I think we should know the context so that we can pass that information on and so that we can be realistic in telling our family stories. So you see that I'm giving you the dates there on that census book and telling you again why I think Dollarhide's book is so good. You can look out at every single U.S. Census, folks, out at the U.S. Census Bureau and find the original reports. They are available there. So you can just go out to the U.S. Census Bureau or even out at Google. Just put this in quotation marks, put in 1850 U.S. Census. And you're going to be surprised at what comes up. You're going to see right away that there's a mortality report for that 7th census. And it told you per state, which Montana had been a state then. It tells you the cause of the death, the age and the sex of the person, the color, the condition of the person, the nativity or the place they were born, the season of decease, meaning that time period, the duration of the illness, and the occupation of the persons reported to have died in the 12 months preceding the 1st of June of that year. The good news is some states took this on and said, you know what? We could do this for every year. We could get this started now. You'll see that mainly in the Midwestern states and in the Eastern states because they had more robust gathering capabilities within their state governments. But then you see it spreading west, and you see California putting together quite a good system. They were a little ahead of some of the other places in the West and the Northwest. But I urge you to look at those. I have one today within the library that people can begin to look at overall so that you can begin to see what was there. I know I became very interested when I could just add just a few lines to the possible death for a person. And besides, if you happen to be in that certain time frame between the 1st of June that year, the preceding 1st June and May 31, and someone dies, you're getting some excellent information that you didn't even know you were going to get, but you have to get it from the mortality report. And they are available various places online. In the 1850 report, what's interesting is they also did that same information about free slaves and people who were slaves at that time. They did not have the names as they would with the other reports, but you're at least getting some idea of the condition, the miserable condition of people when they were enslaved. And so it gives you another idea, again, of what happened. This is mainly for the leading cities, but the information is there for the states that saved the info. There are pre-1790 censuses that you may not be available. And so I'd look at that New England book that's coming out, because I know Bill's going to have those in there. He's going to tell you about the substitutes, like the 1790 tax substitute, where you can begin to find some things and find tax lists and see who was there and who wasn't there from any longer from the previous year. You know, that's a hint about a death. You can even, and this one is just fun, it's just a fun fact I'm going to throw in real quick. Today, even, you can find the most frequently occurring surnames. You know, we're always concerned with the frequently occurring kid names each year, the 10 most popular or the 10 least popular or whatever. But for 1990, for 2000 and 2010, you can look at all the surnames, anything that occurred 100 times or more in the censuses to see what's there. Hey, that's another way to look at what kinds of other surnames are coming in from other countries. And you're going to find that some of the things that we've counted on before, Jones is no longer in the top 3. How about that? And it's pretty easy. They're just zipped files if you want to look at them. If you wanted to do a little article or whatever, these things are free to us out online at the census place, the US Census. So you want to know in 2010, here they are, the 10 most frequent surnames: Smith, Johnson, Williams, Brown. You have to see Jones doesn't come in until 5. Garcia, Miller, Davis, Rodriguez, and Martinez. Most popular names. You can find some of that feedback right now, as a matter of fact, if you happen to be one of the states that asks for that info, because it's being collected every day. In the United States, it would just depend on whether your state were asking to collect that information along with its other Business Bureau information for that state. But these things are out online and available to us. So you can look to dive deeper in Census Bureau data, because there's 130 surveys and programs today that are being used. So you can go look at maps and profiles, all kinds of things, and there's really a lot on death. And what happened during certain times, what places were more likely to have plague, what places were more likely, because the West is still being reported on for plague, by the way. And Montana had, was last reported on, I believe, 3 years ago for plague, because we had 1 or 2 cases. Here's what a Census Bureau thing looks like. Here's just the population of Montana from 1870 to 1900. This is what they could do with the population data in Montana. And for that same thing, there's a report on some death. I'm not going to give it to you here. I'm just showing you what this looks like. So hopefully at least one or two of you, or all of you, I hope, take 10 minutes someday and go look at some of this stuff, because it can be helpful to you. If you want to fill out a record, for instance, which I would for my grandpa who was solidly in Montana by 1901, then I could fill out and say, that he was here during a time when the population was less than 250,000 people, and they'd had an 84% increase in population since 1870 when they first took that data for the Montana territory. Hey, that's another line or two, and it helps give context to my family as to what Grandpa Oscar was doing here in 1901 when he was this 22-year-old or 23-year-old kid running a laundry in Havre, Montana. By 1918, there were standard annual reports, not just reports every 10 years, but they were standard annual reports on mortality. I picked this one for 1918 because it actually comes from some of the things on 1918, because remember, we had a huge flu epidemic that year. In the 1920 report, there's some really neat tables of mortality from influenza and pneumonia in Indiana, Kansas, and Philadelphia. Now, did they target these places? No, those places, Philadelphia did have a formal report. Some other places had made reports, so they were looking at it in terms of their tables of mortality, but that is at least available. However, even that report severely underreported what the deaths were from the epidemic in those areas, just in those areas. They said 445,000 deaths estimated in there, and that was moved considerably up as they got more reports later on. But these reports are available to you. Again, just saying in 1920, we could look at the 1918 stuff. That's only 2 years lag time, and see what happened. So doctors and places that were taking care of the health and were concerned about the health of Americans, they had some better data. One of the things today that I found that I thought was really interesting is this is one of the latest reports that you can look at today. The differences in parental mortality by age and race and ethnicity for 2022. That it's, kids who have lost parents, for instance, between 2019 and 2021, capturing that whole thing on COVID-19. Well, they're looking at and have data on having interviewed kids and having looked at them in various ways so that they can begin to get information on what they need to do for these children who lost their parents. Maybe they lost one parent. Maybe they lost both parents. Maybe, what was their age when they lost a parent? What kind of emotional helps have they needed to have? Who took these people in? Well, we have that data available to us right now as a result of looking at this particular report that came out in May 2024 with one researcher in there choosing to pull the data together for us across the United States and look at the data. So you can go out, you can see that there's a hot link there in data visualization. So you can go out and actually look at that kind of report. We have so much available to us today, and I'm glad we do, because for COVID-19, I don't know about you, but I intended, when I was at home, I intended to clean a room, never got it done. I can look back at my time and know how many days, because I looked at my diary, how many days we were in kind of in a lockdown and what I did. But I'm kind of numb about that. And when I look at the deaths of friends and the people who died, I mean, I have a friend in Great Falls who died right away in the fall of 2020, COVID. And that person was responsible for some grandchildren. She had 2 grandchildren in her home being raised. because her child could not raise them. And uh, I never thought about this. I mean, in passing, I thought about how hard that would be for the parent who lost a parent, plus the grandchildren who lost the person actually supporting them. And I'm so glad that we do have reports like this so that we can begin to get things together for helping these kiddos through this time, because death, and especially that kind of a death uh, at, during a pandemic when we were all panicked, is very hard. So I'm going to ask you to plan to use all the data you can find on a death record. That means not just the death certificate or not just the things in a newspaper. I'm going to ask you to sweep and look farther, to look in your local newspapers. Our most recent thing, of course, was COVID-19. I've had some people say, well, we're totally over it. We don't see that anymore. Wrong. I can tell you right now in Great Falls, we have a quiet epidemic of COVID. We're just more fortunate, most of us, because we do get things like shots that can help us so that we're not as badly affected, but it's going to be with us for quite some time. So record all of that data. Record, when you find your death certificate, I know we do a Snoopy dance. I do, especially if it's from someone a long time ago and I really didn't know them that well or anything. I say, well, I got the death certificate so I can prove this particular thing, but there's more to it than that. There's more to looking at the relatives who were the informants. If they weren't an informant, then why? There's more to those standard definitions on the death certificate today. For a natural death, we can still, if we want to, look at what that natural death implied in terms of how the death was categorized within those. Remember, there are actual standardization guides that are available. Was it a homicide? Was it an accident? Was it a suicide? Or those pending investigation things where they finally let go of the death certificate and it just says pending and you still don't know. I hope you're going to investigate. Use all of that. Write a brief story. So my nephews, as I told you at the beginning of this, asked about their granddad, Byron, via my brother, Mike. Mike is my only surviving brother. We're the last two left out of 5 siblings. Our dad was Byron Robertson Lee, and he died at a very early age. He was 58, 1969. I can remember I was pregnant with my child, and it was a big shock. I can remember that I had been out picking huckleberries, and I was cleaning them when I found out that my dad died. And I was numb. My brother Mike, just like I did, he attended the funeral, but he said he doesn't remember much about it. The one thing he could tell his kids is he said, I know my dad had a crucifix on his chest, and I thought that was weird because my dad was not really religious. Well, I could tell him, hey, but Aunt Louise, the person our dad was living with, was very religious, and so it was going to be a big time Catholic funeral. So here's what I finally wrote to him that I thought he could pass on to his kids, where he wouldn't get too much information, but he'd get some. I passed on the death certificate that I was able to find for free out on Washington State digital records, because they're out there. Not all of them, but most of them. And it gave me quite a bit of information. And there's that one line that's down there in part 2, died without medical attendance, meaning, well, we know he dropped. He was picking up an oil drum and he dropped and died. They tried to revive him for about 20 minutes, but the revival attempts were unsuccessful. And so the King County Medical Examiner was actually the person who gave the information. And immediately my brother said, I wonder why Aunt Louise didn't. Well, because he was writing the information out right then. So I've given him this. I gave him the tiny article that I found in the Seattle Daily Times. Man dies while loading fuel oil. Byron R. Lee, 58 of 217 A Street Northwest in Auburn, collapsed and died while loading an oil barrel onto a pickup truck at the fuel yard where he was employed about 9:15 a.m. yesterday. Lee, a driver for the Robertson Small Heating Oil Company, blah, 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 was pronounced dead at 9:35. That's it. That's what was ever in there. Yes, there was an obituary at the church. Yes, I can tell him our dad did have a crucifix on his chest. And from that, I wrote a thing that just said, Mike, I don't know what you remember about dad's death. Evidently not a lot. So here goes. Our dad, Byron R. Lee, was DOA at the Auburn General Hospital, King County, Washington, when the ambulance crew brought him in at about 10 a.m. on August 8, 1969. According to his death certificate and a brief newspaper article, he collapsed and died while loading a barrel onto a truck, blah, 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 where he was employed as a driver. He was just 58. He'd lived at Auburn for a short time with our Aunt Louise Heron, his sister. He'd come from Western Montana, where he'd lived since 1940. The death certificate said the informant of his death was the medical examiner. He was autopsied, and it was determined that he died of myocardial ischemia, which I translate to mean he had a fatal heart attack. I don't know why Con, our brother, or Aunt Louise were not informants on the death certificate. I suppose the med examiner just filled in what was known. So Mary Nanick, my dad's mom, was not noted. I'm sending you the death certificate, free, by the way, at Washington State, where you live, and the little article along with my summary. Love, Dan. Now, I was surprised. He passed that directly on to the kids, and they're saying, oh, that was such a nice death story. And I'm saying, what? I'm saying, I'm giving you some information so you can go further. With that, I'm going to return to and stop the share and say, those are some of the things that I have for you today in terms of this. I'm happy, and I will send out to each one of you, since I have your names, the death statistics timeline that I have in brief, because it does highlight just the things that have happened in the United States once we became states and once we had these various kinds of civil registrations. But don't forget the other kind of registrations, and don't forget, with regard to church registrations of death and civil registrations, if they both exist, for goodness sakes, get them. Get both of them. It's very, very important. There may be other kinds of information there. Get the recollections of people who attended a service, or the pictures that are included with the people who were at the particular funeral event for the day, because it's going to be very important for your families. Collect all of that stuff and put all of it into at least a 1 or 2 page story about that particular person, including their obituary, so that the ages after us have the information, which is so readily available to us right now, but it might not be later on. Remember, there are no guarantees that the information that we've got out online today will always be there. What if there's a contract that Ancestry has with a particular state, and the contract goes off after 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and they obediently remove the information as a result of that? Make sure you get the information. Do not go back and say, well, I know where I can find it. Get it now.